Halvar gripped the steering oar tightly, watching his crew work feverishly in front of him. Some men were busy scooping water out over the side rails. Others were adjusting the sail as it violently flapped against an unexpected headwind, and still others labored while groaning in unison, propelling the ship against the wind-whipped waves that crashed against the hull, creating sprays of ocean mist. The days had merged since they departed the desolate, frozen shores of Greenland, which felt worlds away from the rich forests and fjords of his native Norway. Day after day, they had sailed onward across a seemingly endless blue horizon, trusting that the North Star above would guide their course across the sea. Halvar heard a piercing cry above and looked up to see seabirds circling in the gloomy sky. Moments later, a massive, cliff-edged coastline emerged from the fog, looming like the giants of Jotunheimer. Halvar let out a victorious yell, joined by his cheering crew. They had successfully completed the route pioneered by Leif Erikson. Vinland was before them. While Halvar and his men are fictional, the extraordinary voyage they made to the eastern seaboard of Canada was real, as were the sturdy ships that allowed the courageous people of Scandinavia to launch raids, conduct trade, and journey from Persia to the New World. In this video, we will delve into the history of Viking longships, examining how they were built, manned, and how they enabled the Vikings to become the preeminent sea power of the medieval world. What is the longship? Throughout the 9th century CE, the Franks, Anglo-Saxons, Khazars, Slavs, Greeks, and Arabs all shared the experience of being completely unprepared for the speed with which the Northmen could attack. Patriarch Photius of Eastern Rome compared the sudden appearance of Varangian attackers outside the sea walls of Constantinople to a thunderbolt from heaven. The Vikings owed their surprising success to the iconic vessels that facilitated their long-range raiding tactics. Much like the British Empire centuries later, it was through naval superiority that the pagan Norsemen established a global presence, conquering territories from Ireland to Russia and mastering riverine trade networks that extended from Sweden to Mesopotamia. The secret to the longship's military effectiveness lay in its shallow hull. Other ships typically had deeper keels, making them vulnerable to getting caught on shoals, reefs, and sandbars, forcing them to anchor far out to sea and use smaller boats to reach shore. Conversely, the longship's low profile allowed it to land directly onto beaches, surprising coastal settlements and swiftly retreating with their loot before a defensive force could be organized. Another significant advantage of the longship's ability to navigate shallow waters was its capacity to sail directly up rivers. While other warships only posed a threat to a kingdom's coastlines, Viking longboats could penetrate deep into enemy lands, menacing cities far inland. In the west, the longship's control over waterways like the Rhine, Seine, Thames, and Severn carried Viking raiders to Paris and transported the great heathen army deep into the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. In the east, the longship's mastery of the Don, Dnieper, and Volga rivers allowed Norse warriors to access the highly profitable markets of the Abbasid Caliphate and establish contact with the Eastern Roman Empire, where many Norsemen would later serve as the emperor's elite bodyguards. While navigating down to these powerful southern empires, the men of the longships also became the ruling class of a confederation of Slavic tribes known as Kievan Rus, the medieval precursor to the modern nations of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Like all effective military cultures, the Vikings understood the importance of psychological warfare and designed their warships accordingly. Such was the decoration of the ships that to those who were looking from afar, they seemed to be made more of flame than wood. So great was the appearance of the fleet that if its lord had wished to conquer any people, the ship alone would have terrified the enemy before the warriors aboard could join battle. Unlike the Roman vessels that partly influenced their design, the Viking longship was not a battleship. Its main function was not to engage in combat, nor was it equipped with ballistas or the ramming apparatus found on ancient vessels like the trireme. However, the longship was versatile enough to be used in naval combat occasionally, when which the Norsemen would lash their vessels together to form a large mobile fighting platform from which they would launch arrows, javelins, or other forms of missile fire onto enemy ships.
The longship as a cultural symbol. The cultural significance of the longship to the Viking Age Scandinavians is clearly evident in the archaeological findings and narratives they left behind. Images of longships appear in thousand-year-old graffiti on the streets of Viking-era Dublin, in equally old toy boats crafted for children, and on coins minted by Danish kings in the 9th century. Longships were symbols of wealth, power, and status. They were costly to build, exclusively owned by the elite of Nordic society, and famously served to transport the most powerful Norse jarls and kings into Valhalla. The Viking funeral rite of ship burning is one of the most widespread cliches in Viking pop culture, and there is historical basis for this stereotype. The 10th century Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan describes the death of a Norse chieftain on the Volga River, who was cremated within his ship alongside a slave girl sacrificed to accompany him to the afterlife. Ship burnings, however, were just one variation of how Viking boats ferried souls into Odin's halls. Within Scandinavia itself, funerary longships appear to have been buried beneath the earth along with the body of the deceased chieftain and an array of Greek silks, Arab silver, and other material wealth, acquired through plunder, tribute, or trade. Unlike ship burnings, which presumably destroyed anything valuable, ship burials have yielded rare examples of relatively well-preserved Viking vessels, such as the Oseberg and Gogstad ships, excavated in southern Norway and dated to 834 CE and 905 CE respectively. These longships, now housed at the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, have provided modern historians with extensive knowledge about how Viking vessels were manned and sailed, as well as how they developed from older ship designs dating back to Scandinavia's prehistoric past. Origins of the longship. The famous Norse longship did not suddenly materialize in 793 AD, the moment the Norsemen decided to sail over to Northumbria and pillage some monasteries. As the culmination of an ancient shipbuilding tradition, the ancestry of the Viking longship can be traced through its distinctive shingle-like clinker-built hull, a feature also present in earlier phases of Scandinavian shipbuilding. The earliest known precursor to the Viking longship is the Hortspring boat, preserved in a bog in Denmark and dated to around 350 BC, making it roughly contemporary with the young Alexander the Great. The Hortspring boat features a hull composed of two overlapping planks on each side, with a central plank in between. It lacks many features of later Viking ships, such as oar ports, a steering blade, or a sail, but is generally considered to represent an early stage in the Norse clinker-building tradition. The next major link in this evolutionary chain is the Nidam boat, also found preserved in a Danish bog and dated to approximately 320 CE, contemporary with the Roman Emperor Constantine. Like its Hortspring predecessor, the clinker-built Nidam boat also lacks a mast and sail, yet it had developed several features found on the later Viking-era longships, including oar ports and a steering blade on its starboard side for improved navigation. These innovations were likely adopted from the ancient Romans, who maintained extensive trade ties with southern Scandinavia at the peak of their power. Further development is represented by the burial ship from Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, England, dated to around 600 CE. The Sutton Hoo ship was built by the earliest Anglo-Saxons, whose ancestral homeland was in southern Scandinavia and the surrounding regions. Its hull was clinker-built, and it possessed the starboard steering blade and oar ports characteristic of the Norse longship, although it also lacked the mast and sail of later Viking vessels. Therefore, it is a striking piece of historical irony that the Saxon rulers of England were later overthrown by their Germanic cousins, who arrived in dragon-headed vessels very similar to the ships that had brought the Saxons to British shores centuries earlier. It was not until the late 8th century CE when Scandinavian shipwrights adopted the sail from their southern Frankish neighbors that their already robust rowboats transformed into the iconic, long-ranging sailing ships that would inaugurate the Viking Age and launch the Norsemen from their North Sea base onto vast sea voyages to Africa, Asia, and even North America.
Anatomy of the Viking longship. At first glance, the Viking longship's design appears fairly basic, little more than a canoe. Yet the construction of the longship was deceptively complex. One of the keys to their success was the aforementioned clinker building technique. While other European vessels of the early Middle Ages were constructed with planks aligned edge to edge, carvel-built, Norse longship hulls were clinker-built, composed of overlapping planks to create a roof shingle-like pattern. Clinker-built hulls offered several benefits, significantly reducing water resistance while reinforcing the overall structural integrity of the hull. In contrast to other shipbuilding styles, where a thick, heavy frame supported the hull planks, the planks on a clinker-built hull were designed to support each other, allowing Viking longships to have thinner frames, which made the longship faster and more flexible. The finest woodworkers of their era, Norse shipwrights skillfully split tree trunks along their grain using a hammer and pegs to maintain the natural strength and flexibility of the wood before shaping it with an axe. This was highly specialized work that professional shipwrights spent their lifetimes mastering, resulting in exceptionally durable vessels that combined light weight, elasticity, and structural stability. The longship's primary steering mechanism was the side rudder, fixed to the right side of the hull. This steering blade, likely adapted from the Romans and known as steerboard in Old English, is the origin of the modern nautical term starboard. The longship's single sail was typically made of flax or wool and supported by rigging made of horsehair or walrus hide. Fixed at the center of the hull on a mast that was held in place at the base by a keelson, a massive block of timber that reduced the risk of the mast snapping in the strongest winds. We can assume that Norse sailors preferred to harness the wind rather than relying on their own muscle, but rowing was often essential nonetheless. Oars were inserted through specialized portholes cut into the upper plank of the hull, and were used when navigating near the coast or on a river, in calm, breezeless conditions, or against unfavorable headwinds. Variations on the Viking longship. Norse longships were not mass-produced in a factory, and consequently they varied considerably in size and shape depending on the time, location, and builder. Surviving sagas and skaldic verses have preserved several Old Norse terms seemingly used to denote different sizes of longships. Smaller longships that might have carried crews of around 30 people appeared to have been called karvi or snekka, meaning snake, while larger longships that may have carried crews of 60 or more were called skade. A fourth type of longship was the drekki, meaning dragon. Drekki were not defined by their size, which was likely similar to the skade, but by the ornate carvings of a dragon's head and tail on their prow and stern, presumably intended to ward off malevolent sea spirits and strike fear into their adversaries. It should be noted that all of these terms are used ambiguously in the sources, making modern historians hesitant to precisely categorize different types of Viking longships. What historians are reasonably certain of is that Norse longships were not built exclusively for battle. At least initially, they were multi-purpose vessels that functioned as both warships and merchant vessels, being agile enough for raiding, yet broad and deep enough to carry ample cargo. This makes sense, considering that the first Viking explorers were plunderers, not conquerors, and they were as active as traders as they were as raiders. One iteration of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the slaughter of an Axan official and his men, who walked unknowingly up to a group of Norse raiders who had landed on their shores, having mistaken them for traders, likely due to the mercantile appearance of the ships they had arrived in. It was not until the later Viking Age, when the territorial conquest of places like Eastern Europe and the British Isles began, that Scandinavian warlords started to fund the development of dedicated warships, which featured sleeker, longer, and shallower hulls that sacrificed cargo space for the ability to transport more warriors across the seas at greater speeds.
Life aboard a Viking longship. Life aboard a Viking longship was cold, cramped, and uncomfortable, with the crew exposed to the elements and vulnerable to the sharp winds and waves crashing against the shallow side rails. A cautious skipper tended to remain close to the coast, pulling up to land every night and beaching his ship, where the crew would cook a hot meal of porridge from provisions stored below deck before taking down the sail and laying it across the hull to use as a tent for sleeping. These were luxuries unavailable on open ocean voyages, during which crews likely slept beneath blankets made of seal and walrus skin and survived on cold salted fish. A Norwegian legal codex dating back to the 11th century called the Gulating offers some insight into how the crew aboard a longship were organized by rank and duties. Normal crewmen were called holumen and were responsible for rowing the oars, trimming the sail, keeping watch, and bailing water from the hull. The ship's helmsman was called the sunvur, and the crew may also have included a dedicated cook, a barber surgeon, and even a skaldic poet to entertain the sailors with stories and songs on the long journey. The most important man in any seafaring crew was the skipper, or stýrimaður in Old Norse. The skipper was appointed by the king to, among other things, organize the longship's construction, select its crew, maintain discipline at sea, and serve as the chief navigator. Unfortunately, we know little about the navigation techniques the Vikings utilized. Yet, considering their ships journeyed from Africa to the Arctic Circle, they must have had highly sophisticated methods for charting their way through unfamiliar waters. They may have memorized currents or read the stars, the sky, and the wind. They may also have used sunstones, a type of quartz that polarizes light and when held up to the sky can help determine the position of the sun and thereby the latitude and heading of the ship. The crowning achievement of these wayfaring techniques occurred around 1000 AD when the crew of the Norse explorer Leif Erikson arrived upon the rugged, cliff-edged shores of a territory they called Vinland, having completed a 2,000-kilometer journey from Greenland to what are now the maritime provinces of Canada. End of the longship. The Norse longships survived the end of the Viking Age by several centuries. Even after the kingdoms of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway embraced Christianity and integrated into the Catholic world of Europe, the descendants of the Vikings continued to sail to battle in the same ships their pagan ancestors had. Throughout the 1200s CE, longships carried crusaders from Sweden and Denmark across the Baltic Sea to conquer Finland and the Baltic lands in the name of Christ. In a striking piece of historical symmetry, the very warships that had brought pagan raiders to the churches and monasteries of Christendom were now used by the Christian descendants of those raiders to subjugate the last pagan peoples of Europe. Yet, even by the time of the Northern Crusade, the longship was quickly becoming obsolete. As the Scandinavian world became fully integrated into Christendom, the importance of trading began to surpass the importance of raiding, and the longship began to lose prominence to the cog, another class of clinker-built sailing ship popularized by the merchant cities of North Germany. Cogs were cheaper to build, carried twice as much cargo, and possessed broad, deep hulls and high defensible sides, which made them effective as both trading vessels and coastal defense, negating both the mercantile and military advantages that had long given the longship its edge. The kingdoms of Scandinavia continued to incorporate longships into their royal fleets to as late as the early 1400s. However, by the time that the cannon-bound caravels and galleons of Spain and Portugal had begun to colonize the world, the longship had been entirely relegated to the pages of history, where its legacy lives on in the passions of the archaeologists, historians, and reenactors who continued to be fascinated by it and the era it represented to this day. More videos on naval history are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see them. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. Our patrons and YouTube members can watch more than 200+ exclusive videos. Join their ranks via the link in the description or by pressing the Join button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.